Hello and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on We Cast a Shadow by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. Last episode, we continued the discussion focusing on part 2 of the novel. This episode, we will discuss parts 3 and 4 of the novel, focusing on character developments and events.
All right, so we're really excited about talking about the second half of the novel, and look at what the fate is of our protagonist as well as his son, given that where we left off, they had both lost the Penny. So you, Vanessa, had the first passage that you wanted to highlight on 203. That's right at the beginning of part 3. And I was wondering, what is it from part 3 that beginning that you wanted to, that drew you in?
I just really like the writing style, how he's just, because in the scene he's making breakfast after they both lose Penny. And so it just seems very much like a dance almost. It's very short sentences, but it like flows really nicely.
Yeah.
So it says, the toaster dings. Good. 2 wedges of waffle, hot and ready. Yes, they're processed. Yes, they were probably in cold storage for a decade before purchase. And then it goes on to say, organic syrup, pulsing in the microwave, half minute to the correct temperature, cantaloupe, sliced anonymously before purchase, and hermetically sealed in cellophane. No muss or fuss. One less thing to trouble the heart.
Yeah, I noticed that too, that, the way he begins, it is kind of like a staccato rhythm to the sentences that, it kind of becomes like really, puts you in there with like this rich variety of dishes that he's making, some of which might sound simple, but it's still something, and it's a nice little breakfast, and that he even, on 204, like he even starts kind of making giving you a recipe, and directing the reader to just like explain what he's doing for Nigel. And I think we talked about before in this podcast that, the role of food and how it's made a communal ritual is something that can bring people together. So I think him and Nigel here, now being just the two, is a little moment that kind of gives him a little bit of that. So I think it's important, because of that, and especially because as we find out later on that, his father actually never really cooked, so he's still kind of new to all this.
Which is why it's so simple, but it's still like that effort that he's putting in.
Yeah.
To kind of make things seem a little bit normal.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think that sense of normality is can be found in something as simple as this, just making breakfast. And he mentions how like he compartmentalized the routine, into something I can handle efficiently. So yeah, it's a nice little change of pace, for sure, because we just witnessed, Penny become victim to getting run over by a police officer. And so it's very tragic, it's very like heavy, and, kind of have to put the book down. And so it's nice to kind of get this little break, even if it's just a simple meal. After the this opening scene, I had another passage on 218, 219. And just as an aside, Vince, did they ever say what ADSI stands for? The organization?
I think they do in part 2.
Yeah?
Let me see if I can find it.
Okay.
No, I don't think they do.
Yeah, I don't recall it either. Unlike, PEG and PHH. I mean, BEG. So I just found interesting the way that ADSI is represented. It reminded me of, the Black Panthers and other, Black rights movements over the decades that have emerged. Here, they're talking to Ickstein from PHH, and he's kind of lamenting how ADSI has been kind of, or people who are purported to be ADSI have been causing trouble at the hospital with protests and terrorism and such. So he's really worried about his profit margin. But then Nigel says here to 18, they're real. I've seen them. And then Eckstein replies, young man, the original ADSI was a community-minded group that tried to build people up, not killed them. They provided job training, healthy breakfast. They even put on an annual Pride festival called Visions of Blackness, which is something is referred to later on. It was beautiful to see until the government started sending in infiltrators. And so this is very reminiscent of the way that FBI infiltrated organizations like the Black Panthers and even just the police, as we've seen with Black Klansmen. So it's very common. And it's interesting also that ADSI itself was peaceful and perhaps became radicalized because of how they were infiltrated. And yet, the narrator here says, Sir would have disagreed. He thought old ADSI was a bunch of self-centered radicals. It was one thing to organize and protest, but grandstanding was almost always counterproductive, in his view. ADSI's tactics led to a whitewash, which led to the world Nigel and I lived in. So I just found that really interesting too, that, apparently the way that the world is in this setting is partially because of the way that ADSI allowed or gave the government an onus or perhaps a pretext to actually, create these unjust and racist conditions that they find themselves in. Nevertheless, that someone like Sir, not surprisingly, doesn't see them as the peaceful, nonviolent organization that they are, and so it also shows again that how some of the Black characters in this novel, most predominantly, of course, the narrator, don't see protesting and organizing as a way of actually fighting back, as a way of resisting, But yeah, that was my 2 cents on ADSI. And of course, it's going to take on a more important role later on. So now I realize it is kind of foreshadowing what's going to happen.
Yes.
And I think just a few pages later, right, in chapter 28 onto 22, you wanted to highlight something here where the father, now without Penny in the way, takes Nigel to Dr. Nzinga, who's the doctor who can actually perform the process. Right. So this is something you wanted to talk about.
Yes. Well, I just wanted to touch on the fact that this is like he's finally going through with it and taking him to the doctor.
Yeah.
But also, I wanted to talk about how Nigel tries to get out of it, kind of. So he asks him to play a game, and then so they're playing dice, and then it turns out that they end up being loaded dice.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really funny because he told him even though he was gonna win.
Right. Yeah, I was, would go back. I came back to that passage a couple of times, and I was like, why did he do that? What do you think? Like, why do you think Nigel, even his dad, right, is surprised that he told him, he didn't have to, and it's not like he would have kind of found out,
I think it's just the way that both the narrator and Penny raised him. To be honest, I think as much as he doesn't want to be there, he's not going to lie to get out of it, I don't think.
That's a good point. And I think it also shows in Nigel's own character that, he's not willing to do something to that extent that his father might be, and in the sense that his father kept the cream and the demonization cream, the whitening cream, away from Penny, and kept it a secret, so it does show, a level of maturity that unfortunately his father does not possess. And on a little, if we can backtrack a little bit to 223, I think it also shows like that Nigel, even though of course he does not agree with this at all, he's still going to go with his father's wishes and kind of just humor him, and so on 223, the middle paragraph, it mentions a little bit more about how invasive this procedure is. That says, but the process was also preventive and would keep him or his once and future children from ever being black like me. Dr. Nzinga described it as sending out millions of little demolition teams, each crashing a wrecking ball through a ghetto facade. The final stage was the bumps rush, when the tiny crews attached bombs to the melanocytic pillars and brought down the house. So it's something that's going to be passed down, to his own progeny. And that, of course, plays a role, later on in the novel. But it's such a violent procedure, right? In the sense that it doesn't just affect Nigel, but it's going to keep affecting his generations that follow, keep them from their own black identity that they are, of course, endowed with. All because, again, of the father's, delusional way of just avoiding what he thinks is or ameliorating what he thinks, is like the only way of ameliorating something like this, right, is just actually the way that you look, and that'll somehow fix everything.
Right. I also wanted to talk about how Octavia kind of also pushes for this, which is really interesting. And she calls, she says she was going to cover the consultation fees, but she also said, she said, I was a good father for working so hard to improve my son's life.
Yeah, Octavia and Dina, um, and then there's also Crown, right? Is her name
Yes.
like the stage name? Um, they are kind of also part of it, right? I mean, at different levels, they've had procedures, you know, and I think it kind of shows that, this is something that you just do, right? It's something that is just accepted as the norm,
Mm-hmm.
in order to, in the case of Nigel, erase his blackness, or, in the case of Crown, erase like the South Asian look, or what have you. Um, so it's very pervasive, and you know kind of goes back to, I think, what we talked about last time, that he doesn't get much pushback, right? And the very few times that he does, it's few and far between, and it mostly came from Penny. But last time, of course, we talked about how now that she's no longer in the picture, who's going to push back? So except for Nigel, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if we go a little further on 234 and 235, we had talked about, to the listeners, to you all, we talked about Douglas, the black police officer who terrorizes his own community. And so here, we get a very brutal scene. It's very hard to read and get through. But this is basically a scene where Sir is essentially beat into a pulp by Douglas. Um, and something that I think Maurice here is just trying to show the level of violence that comes all because of just some simple misunderstanding, that quickly escalates instead of being de-escalated, um, in part. And I think part of it is also just the way that power corrupts people. When it is given total impunity, and in the sense that Douglas is not going to get in trouble for this. So it starts off here on 234, you know, talking about how Sir is polite, and so he says, "Officer Douglas, can I help you, my man?" And then Douglas says, "I got a report of a stolen beach bike, and you're the focus of an investigation." And at this point, this is, of course, when our narrator was much younger. So this is a flashback. So the narrator says, "My dad didn't steal some stupid beach bike." And then Douglas responds, "Shut him up or I'll shut him up." And of course, Sir, at this point is very worried, not just for his son, but for himself. Um, and, Douglas ends up using the N word. And, he says, "I know you with your merce bags and funny shoes. You think this is a conversation, but this is a soliloquy." And then I like how the protagonist says, "You mean a monologue? If it was a soliloquy, you'd be talking to yourself, Mr. Douglas." But anyway, that's just a little sass from the narrator. But he says, the narrator says, "There's a point of order that I'm sure you're aware of, regardless of whether you're brown as mud or white as milk, that you've encountered regardless of whether you're male or female. In physical confrontations, a woman can get away with a lot more than a man. A guy who flinches while literally under the gun better be wearing a steel chest plate because he's going to take one to the heart. But in all but the most extreme circumstances, a woman has some freedom of body. This is what I believed. Of course, I was wrong. In the scrum, Douglas pushed Mama to the ground. She fell awkwardly on her arm and screeched. Sir shoved Douglas, but Douglas didn't fall. He was like a reed in the water. Um, and so it kind of keeps going here. And Douglas says, "You're going to cry now? Well, go ahead and cry for me." What's wrong with you, Mama? Grimace clutched her arm. This is how you act, terrorizing your people? And Douglas says, you ain't none of mine, and I'm just checking out suspicious activities. Y'all the ones can fly right. Sir here in the passage that keeps going, the scene, we're told Sir wasn't listening. All the coolness and constraint he had exercised throughout our lives was gone. His forehead was bright with sweat. All I saw in his eyes was a lust. He stood up and went for Douglas, and it was a dance. Someone knocked me down. I skinned the back of my hand. The other two police officers there stepped in and grabbed Sir's arm. Douglas cursed, but he struck again. And Sir slumped, a chunk of pink face flesh exposed. A dollop of bread collected at his chin where it dangled. We couldn't find out for days whether Sir was alive. His apology echoed in the empty cell of my brain, and I had a reminder of the event. My brown hand scraped white before the blood came. And this is, after Douglas says, tell me you're sorry, lest you want some more. Say it, the black police officer said. I'm sorry, Sir said. So it's very degrading, aside from being incredibly violent, not just towards Sir, but towards his mom. And again, just like his mom mentions that this is Douglas, someone who himself is black, right? And makes it even more tragic, that it comes at his hands, someone who clearly is just trying to prove himself, prove that, he denies his blackness, as I quoted. So I just wanted to highlight this scene as something that is not altogether foreign to us in the real world. As we saw, yesterday with learning about the case of George Floyd, who was essentially suffocated, by a police officer, even though he kept saying he couldn't breathe, something that we've seen before with Mr. Garner. So again, just kind of another way that, the police becomes an arm of white supremacy. What did you think about it, Vanessa, this scene with how his Sir ends up just, eventually he ends up in jail, and, later on there's a scene, right, where he goes and visits him.
I definitely felt it was very hard to read also. I did prior to all of it happening, there's a scene where Sir's, it's almost like a lecture that he gives to the narrator on top of page 234. He says, you are an angel. Fate in the guise of ordinary people conspires to pull the wings from your body, to break your grasshopper limbs, to leave you crippled in loam, to manically adjust the shape of your skull, to bleed your life's blood onto concrete, to destroy you, destroy your future, to destroy your children's future. Other peoples could rely on our nation's fundamental fairness as a starting point for any hopes or dreams they might have. And I kind of feel like that kind of foreshadows what's about to happen, because then he's bleeding on the floor. Well, his hand's bleeding on the concrete. And so it's kind of a little bit of foreshadowing to the moments that are coming right after.
It is, I think Sir called it right. And, but it also kind of, and this is something that the narrator holds against Sir, is that, to Sir, it's all about respect, right? And, you respect authority, you respect, people in power, etc. And he did that, right? But he still, you know, got almost beat to death, bludgeoned, and he ended up having to apologize. So it kind of disproves, Sir's philosophy of like, yeah, just respect them and they'll respect you, because even though, of course, Sir and the rest of them were innocent, they, of course, didn't steal any bike. They still ended up being victimized in this kind of world. And I think, this really shows the way that police brutality is enacted in ways, in other words, it's enacted in ways that, there's really nothing they could have done otherwise to not become victims, and they were completely, and even if they were completely innocent, even if they were, nonviolent, outside of a sassy line from the kid or the protagonist or two, and women themselves were not spared, the mom. So yeah, it was definitely kind of interesting and something that, like I said, the protagonist ends up holding against Sir, as a kind of a point of pride, right? That I told you so kind of thing. And you said, Vanessa, that you wanted to talk about a scene where there's a flashback, right, where he goes visits him.
Yes.
In prison.
Yes. So it starts on 242, but continues on until 246.
Like 249. Okay.
246. It's interesting to see how the narrator kind of blames his father for what happened. He says on where is it? Oh, okay. On 244, he says, towards the middle of the page, it says, "Thanks a lot, Daddy. Now I'm just another son of a convict like most of the other kids in town. Maybe you should let me come back for Take Your Child to Work Day. I can help you dig ditches or make license plates. I've always wanted to work on a chain gang. They say it builds character. We'll have a real great time." So it's interesting how he says that he's just another son of a convict, even though the narrator is kind of the one that was starting the conflict. Because if he had been quiet, like they had told him to be quiet, it wouldn't have escalated the way it did. But he still blames his father for having ended up where he did in prison.
Yeah, it is interesting in that way, Vanessa, in terms of how it seems this is kind of one of the narrator's fatal flaws, that he is unable to take responsibility for something he did, because we've seen this before. Like, he is also, and to some degree, of causation, the result, the cause of Penny dying. He got her riled up, and of course he didn't actually run her over, but that he escalated that. And so, yeah, it is kind of interesting to see him this way with his own father as well. And it seems that the only way he can make sense of the trauma is by placing that trauma on Sir instead of placing it in Douglas. I think it is totally true that, he himself, the protagonist, shouldn't have been, talking back. but I think regardless, like there was like no excuse, right, for that kind of violence, and for something that, of course, they were not guilty of, is like stealing the bike,
Mm-hmm.
um, and but yeah, it is kind of interesting how he kind of keeps holding this against his father. Um, and it also shows kind of how people who become in prison and their family, like how their family, how they kind of just ends up, the people in prison end up losing a sense of their own selves,
Mm-hmm.
because he's not the same person anymore. Um, and it just kind of totally destroys Sir. It doesn't, like, he's really, in other words, the protagonist is really rubbing it in. I mean, I just really felt bad for Sir, and he's already in prison, right? Like, how much worse can it get? For something he was just kind of protecting his family, right? I mean, honestly, like, I think all of us would do the same, right? When a loved one, in this case his wife, gets attacked, even if it's a police officer, like we all would have done something, and acted on them in the moment. Um, so yeah, um, was there something else in this flashback before he revisits him that you wanted to point out?
No, no, I don't think so.
Um, I just think it's interesting that um, he doesn't want to see him. He doesn't want to show him that he feels bad for him. That the narrator feels bad for Sir, and so he just kind of says, you know, the corners on 246. The corners of my eyes moistened. I bit my tongue. I would not cry. I couldn't give him that. He didn't deserve it. And I'm thinking, like, seriously, like why not? Like, what kind of person are you, right? That, like, you can't feel sorry for your own father, and so yeah, it's just another really really sad scene, you know, um, and just a little later, as we get the more recent visit, right? Because he goes and visits again, um, and this is years down the line now that he's got Nigel and everything. Um, and I saw this just as tragic, and perhaps even more so, because on 248 and 249, Sir is practically left soulless, right? Like, he seems like a vegetable. We're told his eyes were wide open, but empty of the kindness I remembered, even when he was upset with me. There was no sign of recognition at all. And, his father still kind of is very stubborn, right? So he says, "Why didn't you warn me how hard it was to be a father? You could have told me what to expect. That was your one job, to get me ready for the world." He keeps holding that against him. And we're told, "Sir blinked without recognition. I could have been a guard, a half-consumed glass of water, the wall. He wasn't in there. The man who had earned a PhD at age 21, right? I mean, that's just brilliance right there. Who could recite Gwendolyn Brooks without a pause, who had given me my words, was gone. I felt as though I were at his tombstone." And at the end, we're told that he would still write to his mom. In other words, that Sir would write to his wife, and he says, "I was stunned by the realization that I managed to lose the same man twice." Um, and at the end, he ends up saying, "Mama, I'm sorry." So I did like that. Unlike this first flashback, in this one, um, unlike in the flashback, in this one, he does apologize to
Mm-hmm.
his mom, and he does kind of provide that sense of closure, uh, understanding that Sir has really has suffered a lot. Was there something that you took from this one compared to the first one, Vanessa?
I I like the paragraph that you read already about how the mama never really stopped talking to him, but he lost him in a sense twice.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to kind of see how he's looking at his own life now, because he does go through these flashbacks and it kind of gives him a little bit of clarity, but he still seems to be stuck in that same spot.
Yeah, because even here, right, he's still taking the plums. So he's got that addiction going on, right, where he's not really fully immersed in the world and present, because he's taking those plums, and it's clearly like his way of coping, right, with these kinds of situations, this kind of trauma.
Yeah. The festival on 275.
Oh yeah, this is where he discovers that his son is an ANSI member, right?
Yes. So he's the narrator's been working really hard to start this festival. I think it's the Visions of Blackness again. Like he's trying to bring it back with the PHH.
Yeah.
And so they're having this festival, and they didn't really set up. I think they set up some tables with like little booths and stuff. And so I think it's really cute that the mom has hers with her restaurant, even though it's been closed down.
Yeah.
But so they're there, and everything's like starting to get it like picks up really quickly. Like in a second, everyone's putting on their masks, and then he notices that Nigel is putting his on too. And he says, they place their knapsacks on the ground and remove sculptures. No, masks. Wooden abstract masks like the ones I'd seen in Booker T. They were the ADSI masks. My son was a terrorist. And then I think this is where it really like turned for him. Because he's not able to find Nigel after this moment. So this is like the last time he sees him.
Yeah, and also interesting from a symbolic perspective, right? That his son is he's wanted to remove that damn spot that he refers to, right? Just like Lady Macbeth, tried to remove that non-existent spot, blood from her hands, right? But now that spot is covered with a mask. And it's kind of ironic, that he's been wanting to cover it with whiteness all this time, or cover it with something, and now that in a sense it is covered, he of course is not okay with that. It's only when it's covered for the way that he wants to imagine it. And, of course, the label, right, of terrorism, I think is interesting too. Something that we talked about already with Eichstein, that, is it really terrorism, right? If they are trying to like make a change, and, what if he's been radicalized, well, that's something. But if he's just really trying to make a difference in society, and the FBI is what has labeled them as terrorists, well, that's something else, and that's nothing new.
I also think it's interesting that Nigel decides to take this route in order to kind of find himself without having to change who he is or how he looks. But his dad was never really able to support him just being... I don't think he would have taken this route if the dad hadn't tried to push him so hard to change how he looked and kind of be this person that he wanted him to be.
Yeah, it's a really good observation. I think, it's kind of like because it's kind of like that whole view of parenting, right? That the more you push someone to do something, the more they're kind of like gonna push back.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems a natural direction, that Nigel would go this route, given all that, And I think it's also tied perhaps to the influence that Penny had, because I try to imagine, well, what would Penny think? And to me, I think Penny would agree with Nigel that it's okay to join ADSI, right? If you're doing what you think is right for your people, for your community.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but feel that this is something we've seen before. A son or daughter doing something against the wishes of their parents, and the parents eventually having to accept them for who they are. I just can't think of specifically right now, but I feel like we've seen this, quite a few times already.
I would think it's similar to Xiomara and the Poetics.
Yeah.
If I had to pick one.
Yeah. I was also thinking of what's his name from Patron Saints of Nothing?
Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name.
I think it starts with a C. Anyway, the cousin, right? The cousin who lives in the Philippines, and how his father is a police officer, and he clearly doesn't agree with that, and he wants to like investigate, or he was, I guess, investigating, or even his own cousin, the protagonist, right? Who, if any listeners haven't read that one, it's a great story about what's going on in the Philippines to this day, due to President Duterte's regime. But yeah, this is indeed the last time he sees him for years, and
right.
After that, as we're told on 282, time passed. He sells the house. Years have gone by, and so he seems to have lost everything: his wife, his son. The Tico itself, including the chicken coop, right, the restaurant, were spared the wrecking ball and converted to condos. His mom moved to Canada. Octavia was deported. So a lot has happened, and just a lot of these things result also in him getting an email from Jojo, where he learns of Nigel's location on 284, and Nigel tells him explicitly, "Don't search for me." But of course, his stubborn dad is not going to listen to that. So he does end up searching for him. And it kind of reminds me of Breaking Bad, those who have seen that last season, in terms of how the protagonist, Walter White, now Heisenberg, goes after the Nazis and neo-Nazis, and tries to rescue Jesse. But when he does encounter him, I had a passage on 312, Vanessa. I don't know if you had one before that.
I didn't have a particular one because I liked the whole interaction between the two of them.
Yeah.
So you could go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think it's interesting in terms of how much it shows the power dynamics have shifted, because of course earlier his dad had an influence on him. He was willing to do that procedure for him, and everything else, right? But here we find out, he's with Araminta, who's referred to as Minty, and they have she's with child, right? So she's pregnant, and they eventually, she actually goes into labor in this scene. And it's kind of interesting on 315. When the girl is born, right? It's a girl. It ends up being a girl. He says she was a lovely little gumdrop with a doll's nose and eyes that seemed to ask what I did. What did I think I was looking at? She was very dark, nearly a reminiscent color, but she might lighten up with time. There's that last sentence there, right? That he couldn't just stop. He couldn't just admire the beauty of a black baby, but he had to imagine that even his own granddaughter, would also go through the procedure, right? And on 312, I wanted to highlight the epiphany, or what I see as the epiphany, where he says, he's trying to convince his son to come with him. And his son, of course, is not listening at this point. It's too late. He's already an adult, and he's got a family. Nigel stared at me with a serenity I'd never seen. For the first time, I realized that his mind was a planet unto itself. During our years together, I'd only caught brief glimpses of that distant world with my telescope, but I suddenly understood that I couldn't make him do anything now. To the extent I'd ever had any influence over my son's orbit, that influence was gone. He was gone from me. He reached out and gently moved the gun downward and to the side. I dropped it. My legs weakened. I found myself on my knees, my arms wrapped around his legs. This drastic shift in the situation, right? He's the one pleading now, to come with him and to listen to him. But he realizes, that his son is gone, right? Like, he's not coming back. The influence that he had, has been lost. And it's an interesting epiphany that, comes too late, but nevertheless, it does come. But yeah, this is just what I wanted to highlight from this scene where, you think that maybe they'll reconcile their differences, but, he's still very much is, unable to accept his granddaughter because she's black, and unable to accept that Nigel is unwilling to, to finish that procedure.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's interesting, like, throughout their entire interaction, how you realize that there's so much you missed, especially in the eyes of Nigel. Like, how Minty was there at the plantation with them, and then how Penny was basically miserable, it seems like, from Nigel's description.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know that because you only see like what the narrator gave you, but now you're getting all of these other pieces, and like they kind of connect.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting way of the point of view, limitation, right? The unreliable narrator, right? That we've been at the mercy of, and it's not surprising, right? And it's perfectly satisfying because we know that his father was incredibly stuck in his ways, right? So all of this does make sense, right? It doesn't come off as like, something that is incredulous or leaves us incredulous. So yeah, I also think that was really interesting. And we also come to find that his father went through the whole procedure, right? That he is now listed as like American white, so, that's why in part why Nigel doesn't recognize him at first.
Yep. I also think it's interesting that he never really considered getting the procedure for himself until after Nigel left. Like, there's never once a mention of him getting the procedure for himself.
Mm-hmm.
even though he's pushing his son to do it.
Right.
So I think that that's very interesting that he didn't, that was never really like an option until after Nigel left.
Yeah, that is interesting too. Like, why do you think that is? That not until he lost his son, he decides to actually go through with it.
I think he thought it was going to help him, like, gain closure and help him in advancing his career. But you don't really, it doesn't really talk about his career after he gets the, after the festival, really.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, he ends up like pretty much stranded, right? I think he loses his job, and then like he ends up in this shanty town where like he becomes disabled, right? He loses or practically loses like his use of his foot and leg. Right, he loses everything, and I think part of it might also be that, and this is on 316, 317, right, where we learn of this, that he maybe thought that by going through the procedure himself, that he could show his son, look, I did this, why can't you? So I think that was also on the back of his mind. But as we said, Nigel doesn't oblige him. And so we're told here on 316, the aforementioned minor events from a short period of my insignificant life compelled me to jot down these notes in my big boot notebook, the notebook that Penny discovered. In retrospect, I realized that, like Mary Magdalene and Dante before me, I've suffered a kind of social death. I've been thrown off the social step stool. I have a name and country, but I'm no longer a husband or father, and I no longer possess an identity I recognize. My fumbling attempts to make sense of my absurd predicament, the iron bars persist even with my eyes closed, have been in this sense successful, as you have seen. So I like this passage because of the poetic justice. He has clearly lost everything. His wife, his son, his job, and his identity too, as he himself kind of just, recognizes. So I think this recognition scene is important in terms of just seeing what he calls that social death, in terms of like, in the sense that, well, in what sense is he alive, if he doesn't have family, if he doesn't have a vocation, if he doesn't even have any kind of recognizable identity that, not even his own son acknowledges. And the allusion to Dante, and Dante's the Inferno, I see as like, or Mary Magdalene, right, who was seen as like, shunned as a prostitute. I see as, he's going through his own hell, and he is going to have to find a way to come out of that hell, just like Dante does eventually. And Dante, had a guide, Virgil, and Mary, had Jesus. So it kind of makes you wonder, well, who's going to guide our narrator out of this personal hell? So that was my, last passage. What about you?
Well, I like the ending, but I don't know how much of it I want to give away.
I think, we can give that spoiler alert to listeners. So if you haven't finished it, readers, you can stop here. But if you're still curious and don't feel it's okay, because you're going to read it regardless, you can proceed.
Okay. So at the end, we find out that the whole book is addressed to Nigel.
Mm-hmm.
So it's his dad talking to him. Where is it?
I think on 319 maybe, or
oh yes. I have placed Jojo in possession of this text by sending it to him in the same way that he communicated Nigel's message to me. Estate lawyers use an old scheme for the distribution of property to heirs. If the child dies, the grandparents. If the dead, patriarchs and matriarchs, then distant relations. When all kin have been wiped from the earth, the people take all. But if strangers are reading these words, then neither he nor I remain. And I think that's really interesting because we just finished it.
yeah.
So that means that they're gone.
Right. Yeah. We were talking about this a little bit yesterday, the other day, about this ending, right? And what to think of it, in terms of it being like a free narrative, and how he kind of does address that reader, so there's this kind of postmodern element to it that we also see in Invisible Man, because in that one, at the end of Invisible Man, spoiler alert, he ends up underground, but it's the same underground that he was at the beginning, so he's just kind of returning to explaining how he got underground in the first place. So it doesn't really spoil it. But, here, just like Dante, just like the Invisible Man, he does end up in a sense, in a real sense, of course, underground, but what did you make of that, where he says on 320, I need you, Nigel, to read this addendum to the foregoing narrative and take some insight. These words are what's left of my heart, and therefore your eyes only, not to save you, and I think he finally realizes that, right? But to give you access to my fractured psyche. Perhaps you will know me better than I myself.
I really like that paragraph because since it's addressed to Nigel, it becomes clear all of these things that he's experiencing, and so you really get to see it through his perspective and why he did things the way he did.
Yeah, and I think it's humbling, right? It's a humbling moment for him that he realizes, maybe you as readers, you Nigel, right, my son, can't understand why I did what I did, he kind of leaves like him a message for his own granddaughter too. But I mean, it kind of throws in there, keep her out of the sun, but it's still, just a very satisfying ending to this dystopian story. It's a tragic ending in a very real sense, but in another sense, given that Nigel has his own family, I think it's very uplifting at the same time.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. This is the end of a very relevant novel. We already mentioned, some things throughout this recording of this novel that are still going on today. So we have a little surprise in store for listeners out there for our next episode. So stay on the lookout for that, because we've been pretty busy this month of May with some important deadlines. Some of those things might get pushed back to early June, but please bear with us. Stay safe and healthy, and we'll look forward to announcing our surprise later on.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing We Cast a Shadow by Maurice Carlos Ruffin. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.